Yes, the question was how long is the road and where did I stay, where can you stay along the way? The answer is the road is almost exactly 3,000 miles long. It's almost, that's I think, almost exactly the width of the United States from New York to Los Angeles. And yes, there are hotels all the way across. They're not, I mean, they're fairly basic. They're fine in the bigger towns. There's, you know, towns that I'm sure you've never heard of, the city of Hefei. It's got sort of 6 million people, and most people in the West have never heard of it. You know, there's a Holiday Inn, there's a Hyatt in Xi'an, there's all some of the Western brands that are coming in. And I sort of, actually in Xi'an I did stay in the Hyatt for a couple of nights, but I then immediately dived back into the countryside and stayed at the Chinese hotels. I tried to stay at the Chinese hotels as much as possible, just because as I traveled, I was trying to travel, you know, on the buses, hitching with the truckers, some taxis, but traveling with the people so that I wasn't just sort of crossing in my Western bubble. But certainly there's plenty of places to stay.
Yes. Several months ago, we were in China and we met with the president of the head of the EPA, someone who was as progressive as Al Gore in terms of the environment. And yet his problem was mayors. I happen to work with mayors. And in that country, it's the local governments that are really endangering the environment. Can you talk about that conflict between, you know, the central government, which in fact appears to be anxious to deal with pollution, and the conflict where you've got the economic effort to try and create jobs regardless of the impact?
Absolutely. That's a crucial dynamic in modern China, and often you do find, I don't know if you're talking about Pan Yue, who is this extraordinary visionary guy who is in a position with very little national power, because the environmental agency has not been given any clout to deal with local issues. It's very difficult to know what to do about that, because local officials really are the sort of curse of Chinese civilization in many ways. They've always wanted to do their own thing. They just tell Beijing what it wants to hear, and then they get on with their own business. And they often completely ignore edicts from Beijing. In the Cultural Revolution, sometimes that was used to protect people. It was used for good, to protect people from the craziness that was going on, directed from the center. But nowadays, often it's used to protect their own local interests. And breaking that down is really going to be very, very difficult, especially because there is no local accountability. I think one answer to this must be to introduce more local accountability. And I think that now we've got some grassroots elections in the villages. I think, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I? I think they've got to raise the level up to the townships, so that, because at the moment the local officials, they don't have to take into consideration, they're in complete control of their little fiefdom. And so they don't have to consider, they can make up things to tell Beijing while they get on with their own business. And really, I think you've got to have both sides, more enforcing from Beijing and bringing in more changes from the bottom. The problem is, though, from Beijing's point of view, of course, as far as more local democracy is concerned, they can't do that, because then that's signing their own death warrant, basically. And so I'm afraid this is one of the reasons why, for some of my pessimism, is that the structure is just not flexible enough. It's just not flexible enough to deal with this issue. My main hope would be that, as we saw with AIDS, for instance, Hu Jintao suddenly got it. He realized this was an issue, and he went on television and shook the hand of an AIDS patient. So despite the problems, the main hope that this will happen is that the central government simply gets hold of this issue in a massive way and starts to change the structure so that people like Pan Yue can force through their changes onto local officials. Yes, the religions that by and large are acceptable to the Chinese government are those that don't threaten the Chinese government. So if you are, they've basically realized that with, possibly with now more Christians than members of the Communist Party, 70 million Christians, no one knows the exact number, it's between 50 and 70, people say, that they really can't beat religion. It's just go and say, oh, it's the opium of the masses and then it'll just die out. Clearly, they've realized that the religious belief is growing every day. So what they're trying to do is just co-opt religion and make sure that the people who have religious beliefs don't challenge the political status quo. And so if you are, that's why they're trying to make everybody register, and if you register, you actually won't have too many problems. I mean, you will have some problems. It's the people who refuse to register because, in the Christian case, they believe that's bowing to the communist Caesar. And many of them who've gone through, the older ones who've gone through the Cultural Revolution and decades in labour camps, they just say, you know, give me a break. I'm not going to deal with these people. I'm going to worship in my home. For the Falun Gong, they went and organised a sit-down protest outside Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound, and that was just way over the top for the Chinese government. So the issue for them was not to do with basically what they believed. It was to do with what they turned that belief into. They turned it into a political tool. And I have Christian friends in Beijing. One guy who's just been released from prison, actually, who crossed the line, who said, God is a God of justice, and therefore I must work for justice in my country. He crossed the political line. He started, exposing issues of oppression of Christians, and he got arrested and put in jail for 3 years. So it's still, and the final thing to say about this is it's very random. I have also been in villages where the Communist Party encourages Christianity. Why? Because the Christians are the only ones obeying the law and paying their taxes. There are so, honestly, they said, you go into this place and, oh, tell me your tales of oppression. Oh no, we haven't got any tales of oppression. In fact, the Communist Party, here's the Communist Party Secretary, please shake his hand. And the Communist Party Secretary says, oh, these people are so wonderful. We wish everyone could be a Christian. I mean, amazing, totally amazing. But in the next valley, the local official hates Christians. So a lot of it comes down to, this lifting of the birdcage. A lot of it comes down to local officials and what they think and how it benefits their personal setup. Excellent question. The question was, did I notice cultural differences as I was travelling, and what is the national identity that makes a person Chinese? Well, let's go and ask the monks in Lhasa that. I mean, that is a very, very topical question, because I think the whole point is that the monks in Lhasa do not feel Chinese. A line has been drawn. A history has, I'm afraid, been invented largely. That Tibet has been part of China since the 7th century. Sorry, Chinese people in the audience, I think if we look at objective history, it does not support the Chinese argument that Xinjiang and Tibet have been part of China since the time of Christ in northwest China and since the 7th century. It just is not, it just doesn't show that. That doesn't mean I'm trying to split China, I'm just looking at the objective historical evidence. So I think that this is China's great problem, is up until halfway, where's the map? I think the map's gone. Up until halfway, it's Han China. It's got an identity, it's Confucian Han China. But this is the problem, actually, is that China has the legacy of empire. It has the legacy of the great Qing Empire of the 17th to the early 20th century, where it expanded and it occupied other parts of Central Asia. And so the problem is that how do you reform an empire like that? You can't be a democracy and an empire at the same time.